I'm part of a volunteer search and recovery team. Each year, we participate in a late summer retreat filled with activities to build teamwork and improve our skills. One of the exercises involves night training, which is exactly what it sounds like, honing our ability to search for and assist in rescues after dark. My specific role is K9 recovery specialist, which is how I got involved in the first place. I've always loved working with animals, but never had the academic credentials to pursue veterinary medicine. Joining this team as a dog handler gave me the perfect balance of meaningful volunteer work and spending time with dogs. And while playing with the dogs might not be entirely accurate, you get the general idea. On one particular night exercise, my dog, trained to detect traces of human remains, alerted us to a scent. I was partnered with a more experienced team member at the time. When I glanced at her for guidance, she simply said, "Let's see where it leads." Now, you might wonder why we weren't immediately panicking when the dog picked up a scent of remains. The explanation is straightforward. Even highly trained cadaver dogs can sometimes be mistaken, especially in a damp environment like Oregon, where it rains heavily and consistently. Wet conditions can confuse scent trails. Our approach was to let the dog follow the trail. Either it would turn out to be a false alarm, or, in the worst-case scenario, we'd discover previously unidentified remains. While the latter might sound grim, it's a central part of what we do. The senior member and I decided to temporarily split up. She waited on the main path while I followed my dog into the woods. Both of us assumed it was likely a false alert and figured we'd be back on course within a few minutes. However, those minutes stretched into 10 as my dog led me deeper into the forest, and then down a steep embankment. That's when I lost my footing and tumbled hard. I landed awkwardly, my chest blazing with pain, likely from fractured ribs, and blood dripping down the side of my face where I'd hit a rock. My first move was to activate the emergency alert on my GPS, notifying the base team that I needed help. My second instinct was to call for my dog, Max, who had bolted during my fall, likely spooked by the sudden commotion or still pursuing the scent he'd found. Lying there in pain, disoriented and unable to see well after dropping my flashlight during the fall, I shouted Max's name, hoping he'd come back to me. I was also counting on the base team to send help quickly so I could get out of there. I have no idea how long I waited, but the sound of approaching footsteps eventually brought a surge of relief. I called out, assuming it was another team member, but when the person spoke, it wasn't anyone from my group. Their voice was unfamiliar, and the words they spoke sent a shiver through me. The man began talking, his tone casual but unsettling. He mentioned I had fallen into a dried stream bed where accidents happen frequently. He claimed at least one person dies there every year, caught in sudden floods during the rainy season. His words felt eerie, like he took some strange satisfaction in recounting these tragedies. I begged him for help, but he ignored me, continuing his monologue about the dangers of the area. Frustrated and terrified, I demanded to know what was wrong with him. His chilling reply was something like, "You're not in a position to talk to me that way." At that point, I started shouting for help as loudly as I could, even though every scream made the stabbing pain in my chest worse. Then I heard Max. He's part border collie, part shepherd, and very expressive. His distinct whines and barks echoed closer and closer, and as soon as the stranger heard him, he stopped talking. Moments later, I heard the man's footsteps retreating into the darkness. Not long after, the sounds of multiple footsteps and flashlights surrounded me. My teammates had arrived. After they reached me, I wasted no time telling them about the stranger. One of them swept the area with a flashlight, while another asked urgently, "Did he hurt you? Were you pushed?" Though I was terrified the man might have intended harm, I assured them he hadn't caused my fall. He seemed to have stumbled upon me afterward, or perhaps had been nearby all along. They stayed with me until medics arrived with an ATV to transport me back to base camp. From there, I was examined, stabilized, and driven to a small clinic where they confirmed I'd fractured ribs. Painkillers and rest were prescribed, and by the next morning, I felt well enough to share my experience with the rest of the team. Others had also reported seeing a strange man roaming the area that night, someone who wasn't part of our group. Concerned for safety, the team decided to change locations for future retreats. A second encounter with that unsettling figure wasn't a risk anyone was willing to take. Even now, thinking back to his eerie comments and the way he seemed almost pleased by the area's history of accidents sends a chill down my spine. My name is Alex, and I've been a fan of your channel for a while now. I live in Brisbane, Australia, and the story I'm about to share actually involves you and your videos, though in a rather indirect way. I met my girlfriend back in April 2018. She was the one who first introduced me to your channel. Honestly, at first, I thought it was odd that she liked listening to scary stories to relax, but after a while, I got used to it. Eventually, I even started to enjoy them too. We'd often play a video while we did the dishes after dinner. It became a bit of a tradition for us. Then, sometime in early March the following year, we were listening to one of your camping story compilations when my girlfriend suggested we visit a place called Currumbong Valley. Currumbong is about a 3.5-hour drive from Brisbane and is well known among hikers and campers. I know it probably sounds strange that listening to eerie camping stories would inspire us to go camping ourselves, but rural crime is so uncommon that we didn't feel there was any real danger. And truthfully, we weren't in any immediate danger, but what happened next was ironic in a pretty unsettling way. We made the trip to Currumbong and arrived on the 15th of March, 2019. We'd ordered some camping gear online and were searching for a good spot to set up our tent when we stumbled across another pair of campers. They were standing near a charred uda and what looked like the remains of a burned tent about 10 or so meters off the trail. It was a man and a woman, probably in their late 20s. The guy was pacing back and forth, talking urgently on his phone, while the woman stood nearby looking worried. At first, we thought they'd accidentally set their own campsite on fire, maybe a gas stove gone wrong or something like that, but it soon became clear that it wasn't their stuff at all. They'd just stumbled across it like we had. The man told us he was reporting the scene to the police because it looked recent. You could still smell the smoke lingering in the air. He also mentioned seeing some fresh supplies lying around, which suggested whoever had been there hadn't left long ago. Since the couple had already called the authorities, there wasn't much for us to do. We wished them luck and continued our hike, finding a nice spot a bit further away to set up camp. At the time, we didn't think much of it. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing that screamed foul play. It just looked like someone had an unfortunate accident. Fast forward a few days, and my girlfriend sent me a news article she'd seen online. The charred vehicle and tent we'd come across belonged to an older couple who'd gone camping in the same area. Tragically, they hadn't returned home and were now listed as missing persons. Police were asking for anyone with information to come forward, so we got in touch to share what little we knew. We spent 2 nights in the valley and didn't see or hear anything strange during our stay, aside from that one burned campsite. For a brief moment, we even wondered if the young couple we'd met might have had something to do with it. After all, we only had their word that they'd contacted the police. But the authorities assured us they'd already spoken extensively with the person who made the call, so we tried to put it out of our minds. About 1.5 years later, the mystery was finally solved, but not in the way anyone had hoped. The bodies of the missing couple were found, and it turned out they hadn't been victims of an accident. They'd been murdered. Their campsite was burned to destroy evidence, and the killer had fled. Knowing we had unknowingly walked into the scene of a murder was deeply unsettling. According to investigators, the crime had taken place less than a day before we arrived. If we'd come earlier, we might have crossed paths with the killer or, worse, become targets ourselves. As details emerged, we learned the killings weren't random. They also weren't the result of some serial killer stalking the area. The whole thing had started over a dispute about a drone. The killer claimed there was an argument that escalated when one of the victims supposedly pointed a firearm at him. He said he acted in self-defense, disarmed the man, and then killed both him and his wife before burning their belongings and bodies to cover his tracks. The killer's trial was ongoing when I decided to share this story with you. His defense was trying to paint him as remorseful, saying he felt sick over what he'd done and even vomited from the smell while burning the evidence. Honestly, it's just disgusting. Anyway, I hope your channel continues to grow, and I wish you all the best. I can't stop thinking about how senseless this whole thing was. People losing their lives over something as trivial as a drone. It's truly awful. Back in 2010, I tried organizing a camping trip for myself and some buddies. All spring, they'd been hyping up the idea. Just a group of guys, no gadgets, soaking in nature and enjoying the moment. But as the date approached, each of the 4 guys bailed, citing one excuse after another. It was frustrating because I had been so excited for a wild adventure and had spent what felt like a fortune at the time on all the camping gear I thought I'd need. With everyone dropping out, the trip seemed doomed. Then it hit me, why not go alone? The trip was set for mid-July, the absolute best time to camp in the northern part of the region, and rescheduling would mean waiting another year for the same conditions. So, I decided to pack my stuff and head out solo for a few days of camping in a remote park in New England. The 3 days I spent out there turned out to be incredible. I had worried that going alone would leave me bored or restless, but it was the opposite. I was busy the entire time, setting up camp, gathering firewood, arranging the tripwire alarms, and building a fire. By the time the sun set, I was too exhausted to relax. Nighttime in the woods is unnerving, especially when it's your first time camping alone in over a decade. The sounds of the forest had me on edge, but I eventually adjusted and managed to sleep decently on the second and third nights. On the final night, though, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling very uncomfortable. Let's just say nature was calling after 3 days of avoiding the issue. The idea of squatting in the woods didn't appeal to me. Visions of snakes or creepy crawlies kept putting me off, but I'd reached the point of no return. I grabbed my headlamp, switched it to the dim blue light mode to avoid attracting attention, and ventured a short distance into the trees with some wet wipes. I found a spot, took care of business, and began heading back to camp. Just as I got within about 80 feet, I noticed a flashlight beam moving around my campsite. My heart raced. Someone else was there. While there were a few innocent explanations, my gut leaned towards something more sinister. Instead of walking directly back, I quickly turned off my headlamp and crouched behind a tree to observe. The person was shining their flashlight over my camp, seemingly inspecting it. Moments later, a second flashlight appeared, and now 2 people were moving around my campsite. They started talking quietly, and while I couldn't make out most of their words, I clearly heard one of them say, "He was just here." That sent chills down my spine. It's one thing for people to stumble upon a campsite by accident, but it's entirely different when they seem to have been watching you. My mind raced with questions. How had they approached my camp without setting off the trip alarms? What were they after? I stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe, as I watched them talk and eventually agree to come back tomorrow. Then they left. I remained frozen in place, debating my next move. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but that would mean making noise and using my headlamp, potentially revealing my position if they were nearby. I decided to stay put in the darkness, battling fear and overthinking every possibility. Finally, dawn broke, and I felt confident enough to return to my camp. I packed up as quickly and quietly as I could and skipped breakfast, heading straight back to my car. To avoid being predictable, I avoided the main trails and took a longer, less direct route. On the way out, I stopped by the park's information center to ask if any rangers had been patrolling the area at night. They hadn't. In fact, they said no ranger would ever approach a campsite in the middle of the night without announcing themselves. They encouraged me to file a report, which I did, but the experience left me shaken. Even though the trip was unforgettable, I haven't been able to bring myself to camp there again. Evergreen Woods Park was one of my most cherished spots growing up. I spent my childhood in a small town just outside of Wilmington, in a neighborhood called Maplewood. Some of you might have heard of the name, though not for the best reasons. I attended Maplewood High School, the same school as Aaron said and Hannah Lee, the same people whose lives were central to the infamous Clear Signal podcast. For those unfamiliar, Clear Signal was one of the first big true crime podcasts. It recounted how Aaron allegedly killed Hannah, his girlfriend at the time, a case that cast a dark shadow over Maplewood. Wilmington's reputation hadn't been great since the early 2000s, thanks in part to a gritty TV drama that aired during my middle school years. I used to feel a deep love for both the park and my hometown, often defending them fiercely in online gaming chats. But one day, something happened that changed my perspective forever. It was the day I vowed never to return to Evergreen Woods Park. That day was in the summer of 2015. My girlfriend and I decided to go camping there since the park offered great camping spots complete with tables and fire pits. Having spent my childhood exploring the trails and woods, I knew the park like the back of my hand. I especially loved a hidden path along the river, tucked between the water and the railroad tracks. It was secluded, scenic, and felt like something out of a storybook. I couldn't wait to show it to my girlfriend, thinking she'd love it as much as I did. After setting up camp, we crossed the tracks and began our hike. About 15 minutes in, my girlfriend was mesmerized by the river, snapping pictures of the view on her phone. Then, out of nowhere, we heard voices coming from the other side of the water. The river wasn't particularly wide, but the summer foliage made it impossible to see who was there. Suddenly, a man burst through the bushes and splashed into the river. He looked terrified, and as he ran, he tripped on a rock, falling hard into the water. I was about to head down the bank to check if he was okay, but before I could move, he got up, turned around and shouted, "No, please, don't." Then came the gunshots. 3 loud bangs echoed through the air. The man collapsed into the river again, this time motionless. It all happened so fast. One moment, there was shouting. The next, the man was lying lifeless in the water. My girlfriend and I didn't wait to process what had happened. The instant we heard the shots, we bolted. It was a complete shift in mood. Just minutes earlier, I'd been happy, excited even to share one of my favorite places with her. Now we were sprinting for our lives. Though I knew the shots weren't aimed at us, I couldn't shake the fear that whoever fired the gun wouldn't want witnesses. As we ran, I couldn't help but slow my pace slightly, keeping my body between her and the direction of the shots. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was pure instinct. If someone was going to get hurt, I wanted it to be me, not her. That thought chilled me as much as the situation itself. I prayed that we wouldn't be followed and that, if I did get hit, it wouldn't harm her too. My girlfriend was incredible. She ran like her life depended on it, staying quiet and focused, and didn't stop until we were back across the tracks. Those moments were the most terrifying of my life. If I had been alone, or even with a male friend, it would have been frightening, but having her with me made it much worse. There was this primal urge to protect her, even though I knew I couldn't stop a bullet. All I could do was shield her as best I could. Thankfully, we made it out unscathed and called the police as soon as we were safe. To this day, I don't know who the man was or if the shooter was ever caught. What I do know is that I've never returned to Evergreen Woods Park, and I doubt I ever will. The scariest thing I've ever experienced happened during a solo camping trip in late July of 2013. For anyone unfamiliar with the weather in eastern Kentucky or not living there at the time, the area occasionally experiences intense summer storms called derechos. I'm not great at describing weather phenomena, so here's a definition from NOAA. A derecho is an extended, fast-moving windstorm linked to a band of severe thunderstorms. While a derecho can cause damage similar to a tornado, the destruction is typically concentrated in one direction, forming a straight path. For it to qualify as a derecho, the wind gusts must be at least 60 miles per hour over most of its area. To put it into perspective, a weak hurricane starts at around 74 miles per hour. So, a derecho is like a mini hurricane, not exactly catastrophic, but enough to cause serious problems. Now, imagine being alone, camping in the middle of the woods, seeing the sky turn dark, and realizing the wind is strong enough to bring down old or weakened trees. That's when I started to panic. Luckily, while I was searching for a spot to wait out the storm, I stumbled upon a man-made structure, a basic concrete shelter with a single wall. It didn't do much to shield me from the wind or rain, but if a tree fell nearby, it might save my life. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't the only creature in the forest with that idea. About an hour before sundown, while the wind was howling, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps thudding toward the shelter. Between the storm's roar and the shelter's position, I didn't hear it until it was practically on top of me. Then, before I could even react, a black bear came charging around the corner. The storm had clearly terrified it, which was very bad news for me. My immediate reaction was to shout and wave my arms wildly, trying to appear bigger and scarier than the storm. It startled the bear enough that it hesitated, jumped back, and ran past the shelter. But instead of continuing on its way, it circled back, running behind the shelter and coming around again. It was a terrifying loop. Every time it returned, I'd yell and flail, and the bear would retreat, only to come back again, each time closer. I realized it wanted the shelter but was deciding whether fighting me for it was worth the risk. After a few more passes, it was so close I could hear its claws scraping against the concrete floor and its loud, heavy breathing. I kept backing away to maintain some distance, but eventually, I ran out of room. The bear darted in and swiped at me, forcing me to retreat even further. Desperate, I grabbed my backpack and held it like a shield. It was heavy with my gear, so I planned to use it as a battering ram if the bear lunged at me again. My heart raced as the bear came around for what I feared would be the final charge. But when it saw me holding the pack, its appearance must have startled it. The way it changed my size or shape must have thrown it off. It let out a low roar, spun around in a confused circle, and bolted back into the woods. I was shaken but knew staying in the shelter wasn't much safer than leaving. The bear might return, but wandering through the stormy forest meant risking falling trees. Without shelter, even a minor injury could leave me vulnerable to the bear or the storm. I decided to stay put, gripping my backpack and praying the bear wouldn't return. That night was one of the most terrifying of my life. The storm howled relentlessly, and every cracking branch made me flinch, wondering if it was the bear or a falling tree. Somehow, I made it through unscathed, though I wouldn't exactly call it safe. A few years ago, I planned a camping trip with about 10 friends at a remote hot springs in the eastern part of a nearby state. It happened to be a Friday the 13th, and coincidentally, a full moon lit up the sky that night. The drive took roughly an hour, and since I had work the next day, I decided to limit my drinking to avoid a hangover. When we arrived, we picked a nice spot to camp, a little away from other groups. Once we settled in, we cracked open some drinks, relaxed, and later took a dip in the warm springs nearby. As the sun set, we decided to take a nighttime walk to enjoy the moonlit scenery and stars. By then, it was pitch dark, and only a handful of us were up for the walk. A side note, The three of us who went had been microdosing on mushrooms earlier, so everything had a slightly surreal edge, though I kept my senses sharp. It was me, two friends, and one of their dogs. We walked uphill for about 10 minutes using flashlights to guide us and turned onto a smaller trail after a bit. Barely 3 minutes later, we heard loud rustling in the bushes ahead, way too close for comfort. We froze, and my friend leading the group swept his flashlight around. If you've ever seen a big cat's glowing eyes in the dark, you know how terrifying it is, especially when the cat is huge. My heart raced as I realized we were face to face with a mountain lion just a short distance ahead. Instinct kicked in, and we slowly started backing away. However, the dog with us had a different instinct and bolted into the woods to the side. To our relief, the big cat didn't chase her. It kept its glowing eyes locked on us instead. As we kept retreating, we suddenly realized the dog had returned to our side. But then, what had we heard moving through the bushes behind us? We shined our flashlight again and, to our horror, spotted a second mountain lion. This one smaller, likely the first one's cub. Trapped between the two, we had no choice but to climb over the fence into someone else's campsite nearby. We got the dog over first and then scrambled over, tearing up our clothes and leaving my friend with a nasty cut on his leg. Now we were in an unfamiliar campsite, still shaken, under the eerie glow of a full moon on Friday the 13th, with the remnants of our mushroom trip amplifying the surrealness. We saw no sign of the campsite's owners and, in a panic, jumped into their unlocked car. We honked the horn repeatedly to scare off the mountain lions and shouted loudly to make it clear we weren't robbers. No one came to check on us, which felt unnerving. One of my friends claimed she heard faint screams or someone trying to cry out, but her boyfriend brushed it off, saying we needed to leave. Part of me believed her, though I didn't hear anything myself. Either way, I was desperate to get back to our own campsite. On the way back, I mentally prepared myself for the worst and even whispered a few prayers, despite not being religious. Once we returned, I was a complete wreck, convinced every sound around us was the mountain lions stalking us. I had a full-blown panic attack inside the car, while everyone else seemed to move on and enjoy themselves by the fire, even those who had shared the terrifying encounter. By morning, I was a hungover mess and skipped work that day, which led to me getting fired. Honestly, I didn't care. I was just grateful to have made it out alive. A couple of years ago, my partner and I went on a camping trip during the summer in Oklahoma. The first few days were peaceful, but one late afternoon, while we were cooking dinner, we heard someone yelling for help. The voice sounded nearby, just a few campsites over, but out of sight. Without hesitation, we ran toward the sound and stumbled upon a scene straight out of a nightmare. A man was leaning against a picnic table, clutching his abdomen, with blood pouring from a deep cut. He explained that he had been carrying a knife while walking, tripped, and accidentally stabbed himself. The wound was severe, and blood was everywhere. My partner quickly tried to stop the bleeding by applying pressure while I pulled out my phone to call for help, only to discover I had no signal. The nearest hospital was about 20 miles away, so even with service, help would take a while. That's when my partner asked the man where his truck keys were. The injured man managed to tell us, and I rushed to grab them. Within minutes, we had him in the back of his truck and were speeding toward the closest hospital. For me, the situation was especially terrifying because I have a history of fainting at the sight of blood. Even a small cut has made me pass out in the past. Despite my fears, I had to drive while my partner stayed in the back, keeping pressure on the wound. There was no way I could be back there without losing consciousness, and if that happened, I might have fallen out of the truck bed. On the other hand, if I fainted behind the wheel, we'd all be in serious danger. My partner reassured me to focus on the road and pull over if I felt faint, but the adrenaline must have kept me going. We made it to the hospital in about 12 minutes. Later, My partner told me that we'd arrived just as the man began slurring his speech. A clear sign things were getting critical. Any longer, and he might not have stayed conscious, which could have been disastrous. I'll never forget when the hospital staff opened the truck to take him out. There was a puddle of blood underneath him, and my partner's pants were soaked through. Once the man was in the care of the hospital, we drove his truck back to our campsite, where we realized his dog was still waiting. We tried to salvage the rest of the evening, but it was hard to shake off the intensity of what had just happened. The next morning, the man's brother arrived to collect his belongings and thanked us for saving his sibling's life. He told us the injured man had survived and was going to recover. It was a deeply emotional moment. If you've ever had someone thank you for saving a loved one, you'll understand how humbling it feels. We helped the brother pack up his things and wished him well before he left. The experience was terrifying, but knowing we saved a life brought us a sense of fulfillment. It's a memory that strengthened the bond between me and my now husband, and one we'll never forget.